Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey to the automotive world. We talk about the latest news, from new makes and models to new technology to all of the must-have options available. Whether you're a fan of the old classics, love the latest models and technology, or have never met a vehicle you didn't want to work on, the GSMC Car Podcast has something for every car enthusiast.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, David Lucy Mabel. Okay, welcome folks to this week's podcast. Today we are going to be talking about a vehicle that I'm sure is very special to not only you, but to me, to several people around the world, to different sorts of subcultures and pop cultures and all sorts of other, people groups and, I guess car enthusiast communities, people who are not so much car enthusiasts. It's just a very recognizable vehicle that people around the world generally know and generally love. And if you haven't been able to guess so far, it is the Volkswagen Bus. Yes, the Volkswagen Bus, the world's most recognizable, the world's most beloved minivan, if I can put it that way. Or technically not minivan. I guess it's just a van of sorts. But anyway, today we are going to be talking about the background of the Volkswagen Bus, the legacy that it's left behind. We're going to be talking about what it will come back as, and as I promised in segment 4, I am going to give you an update on how my car situation is doing and whether or not my Buick made it from the mechanic shop. So please stay tuned so you can hear the story, and stay tuned so you can learn more about your favorite bus from Volkswagen. So let's get started. Okay, so the background of the Volkswagen Type 2 is actually what it's technically called. Officially known as the Transporter, the Combi, or the Microbus, it was nicknamed the Bus in the U.S., the Camper in the UK, or de Pau de Forma in Portuguese. So I guess in either Brazil or in Portugal, it was called the loaf of bread is actually what that translates to, which makes a lot of sense because when you think of it, it does kind of look like a loaf of bread. It was produced from 1949 to 1967, and this is the original generation we are talking about here. It is still produced today, and it is now in its 6th generation. So I don't know if they call it the Type 2 anymore. I'm assuming that they call it the Microbus or the Combi or the Transporter, depending on what body style it is, but it's the same line of successive vehicles, these Volkswagen vans, if you will. It was the forerunner of a new class of vehicles, cargo and passenger vans. Now, when you really think of it, the concept of a van didn't really exist for the longest time. The concept of a passenger van didn't really exist for the longest time. Before, I guess, what used to be turned into vans that we would know as today were station wagons. Station wagons used to be used as vans, and whenever station wagons were used for cargo, then they were called, I believe, sedan deliveries were the colloquial term for them. So what they would do, they would take out the rear seats, and they would not put any windows. Instead, it would just be panel-sided, and those would be built on station wagon platforms, which were in turn based on sedan platforms. So the fact that there is a bus now is a sort of a game changer. I mean, I guess the first sort of van really was the Scout Scarab, but that wasn't a car that was commonly produced. That wasn't a car I don't even think went into official production. I think it was only in its in its prototype stage when it came out. So the first, van that was carrying passengers, I mean, I can't say this is the very first, but this is probably one of the first and definitely the most memorable and the most successful as far as being in people's memory and probably just in sales or anything of that sort. Because especially with Volkswagen and the Beetle and everything, I mean, Volkswagen sold, not only did Volkswagen sell a lot, Volkswagen was able to capture the minds of the people in some way, shape, or form. Volkswagen was able to capture the minds of the people, thus making some of their models some of the most memorable models of all time. The Volkswagen Beetle. There is nobody that I know of that doesn't know what a Volkswagen Beetle is. Same thing with the Volkswagen Bus. There's nobody that I know of that doesn't know what a Volkswagen Bus is. They might not call it a Volkswagen Bus. They might call it a Van Samba. They might call it a cargo bus. They might call it the Caravan. They might call it a hippie van. But I mean, we're all talking about the same vehicle here. So Volkswagen has been very successful as far as that goes. This Volkswagen Type 2 is what I'm really going to refer to it as, because that's what it technically is under Volkswagen, gave rise to a surprising number of competitors, none of which had the same popularity and cult-like following. I mean, I'm not going to pretend that you all know what a Dodge A100 is. I mean, your real car enthusiasts out there are going to know this, but most people are not going to know that. But let me just, entertain you with a list of competitors that this thing sprung up over the years. It sprung up competitors from America, like the Ford Econoline, which still exists today. Ford Econoline still exists today. I mean, your average Ford van that's not a minivan is a Ford Econoline. We call them the E-series of vans, but that's what it stands for, Econoline. Obviously, there are passenger conversion vans, and there are panel vans that are used for cargo and whatnot to haul things like if you're a plumber or whatever. There's the Dodge A100, no longer exists. The Chevrolet Corvair 95 Corvan. So this one is kind of special because it used the same idea of rear-wheel drive, rear engine layout from the Corvair car, just like the Type 2 did with the Type 1, which was the Beetle. So the Corvan was based on the Corvair platform, obviously. I mean, it's even named the Corvair, Corvan or whatever. And the Volkswagen Type 2 was based on the Volkswagen Type 1's platform. Volkswagen Type 1 is the Beetle, as you all know. There was the Citroën H van. These are the European rivals now. The Renault Estafette. There is the Ford Transit. Now, this is made by Ford of Europe. And then now there are Japanese rivals as well. The Ford Transit, by the way, still exists. The Nissan Caravan still exists. That's a Japanese rival. The Toyota Light Ace, I'm not sure still exists. And the Subaru Sambar. So there are so many different sorts of rivals in similar vans of similar concepts that exist as a result. So this really ushered in a new era of not car design, because it's not like it influenced car design, but it ushered in a new era of car utility, if I could put it that way. This was a new sort of utility in the car world. This was a van. I mean, this was, built for hauling people. This was built for hauling things. And I mean, there was even a pickup truck version of it. It was pure utility above all else. And, the car world hadn't really seen a van before. They had seen station wagons. They had seen panel, what do you call them, sedan deliveries that were basically panel van versions of station wagons, but they had never seen a dedicated van itself that was designed from the ground up to be like that. Station wagons were first and foremost sedans that were stretched and added a cargo area to, and then if you wanted to take it one step further, you remove windows, you remove seats, left the back blank, and then that was used to haul cargo. Pretty simple, really. But this was a different sort of vehicle. This was designed from the ground up to be a hauler like that, which is very important, which is very cool. So it was built on a platform derived from the Volkswagen Beetle, as I've said before. The idea was credited to Ben Pon, a Dutch Volkswagen importer. He saw the Plattenwagen, which was a modified parts vehicle with a flatbed based on the Beetle's platform. Basically, he went to the factory or the warehouse, I guess, to order some Volkswagens so he can take back to the Netherlands with him. And he saw this Plattenwagen, and then the Plattenwagen was a car, like not a car really. It was more like, a parts vehicle that they would just use to transport parts around the factory or the warehouse, wherever it was. And it was built on a Volkswagen Beetle platform. So he saw this. He thought it was a good idea for this to be the basis of a van of sorts. After a few sketches and a couple of prototypes, the final product was an aerodynamic van with a drag coefficient less than that of the Beetles, and it was a new vehicle. It was a new vehicle. It was based on the platform. He saw this was a good idea. So after a couple of sketches, prototypes, of course, it was a lot more complicated than I put it. I really just make it simple because I'm just trying to get the gist of that. But essentially, he created a new vehicle from something that already existed. It had the same wheelbase as the Volkswagen Beetle. At first, what was I saying here? Pardon me. But it basically had the same wheelbase, and it was offered at first as the Combi, which was a van with a removable rear seat, and as a commercial panel van, one without windows and one without an optional rear seat. The microbus and the deluxe microbus were introduced in 1950 and 1951, respectively. So this had been in production since 1949. Basically, what I was just trying to say there is it came out as the Combi first, and then it came out as a panel van. Those were the two models available. And then the microbus came out that had more seats, and then the deluxe microbus, which was like the luxury version, if I could put it that way, that was built more around passenger comfort instead of around cargo hauling. There was even a pickup truck version, used the same 25 horsepower as the Beetle, 25 horsepower engine as the Beetle. As you all remember from my podcast on beloved European economy cars of old, Volkswagen Beetle had a flat 4 engine that had 25 horsepower. This is the same flat 4 engine that they used in the Volkswagen Bus. These things weren't very heavy. They weren't very heavy. They didn't need a lot of power. So they just took what they already had. They already had the platform. They modified it to build a bus on it. They already had the engine. They modified it to put it in the bus. I mean, simple as that, really. The only situation that presented, I guess the challenge, I should say, the only challenge that presented with that was the fact that because this thing was rear-wheel drive, it kind of made loading cargo into the back sort of difficult because you kind of had a high loading floor because of the engine. You couldn't go in as low as you would like to, because the engine was there, obviously. So you had to go in and create a door, a hatch above the engine compartment, and then load in things that way. Whereas the Corvan had a step. It was a side entrance to the cargo area, so it completely bypassed where the engine was, and then had a side ramp, and then you could open it up on the side and then load the cargo in that way, which would have been smart if Volkswagen had done that. But I guess at the cost of styling features, or maybe it just would have been too expensive to completely redesign it after that was an oversight to begin with. So, I mean, granted, the car wasn't perfect, but it really was a forerunner. It was a pioneer in the concept of vans and passenger vans. I mean, think of the 80s. Think of the 80s with these conversion vans here in America. The Chevy conversion vans, the Ford conversion vans, the Dodge conversion vans. I mean, these things very well may not have existed if it hadn't been for the Volkswagen Bus, the Volkswagen Type 2. I mean, these things have a lineage that is attached to the Volkswagen Type 2. Think of it. There had never been camper vehicles before this. When you went camping, goodness, you probably put all your things in the back of your family station wagon, and then you slept under the stars or you slept in a tent. I mean, this is something that you can sleep in. They had, sunroof tops. They had the Westphalia campers that opened up, and then that had, a cloth, like, it's like the top of the van opened up like a camper would, and it had windows and other sorts of foolishness, and canvas backdrop that it would allow you to expand the top of the van so that you can see what was above you, and that you can sleep inside the van while still getting the tent-like experience. I mean, there was a lot of modifications and different versions of the Volkswagen Type 2 available. I mean, Westphalia, I just name dropped them. Westphalia was a coach builder that took these things and turned them into campers. There were buses that were used for transporting people that weren't, for comfort's sake. There was so many. It was such a versatile platform. Everything that Volkswagen made at this time was such a versatile platform. There was nothing that you couldn't do with it. And I believe that was perfect as far as marketing goes. You think of all the other ones, all of its other van contemporaries, none of them were nearly as, none of them were nearly as versatile as this. But please stay tuned after the break, because we are going to be speaking of the legacy that the Volkswagen Type 2 has left behind. The long and illustrious legacy at that, goodness. Not just, hippie vans and mystery machine, but all sorts of foolishness. Great foolishness, by the way. No, that sounds like an oxymoron, but please stay tuned after the break.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
All right, welcome back, folks. Hope you enjoyed that small commercial break. In the last segment, we spoke about the background and the history of the Volkswagen Type 2, also known as the Volkswagen Bus. Now, in this case, in this segment, I should say, we are going to be talking about the legacy that the Volkswagen Type 2 has left behind. The original one, that is. Volkswagen buses and combis and Westphalia and whatever, all that stuff is still being produced today, but I'm focusing on the first generation and the legacy that it has left behind. There are several legacies, I should say, associated with the Volkswagen Type 1. The mechanical legacy. Let's cover that first. It was one of the first forward control vans in the world. This design placed the driver above the two front wheels. This started a trend in Europe, and several different manufacturers came out with similarly based designs that offered a similar level of practicality. So basically, think about your Nissan Caravan or your Toyota Hiace, for example. If you're an American viewer, that's difficult because we don't really have these vans here in America. But look it up. I will entertain you. Just look it up. These are vans in which they offer the most visibility, the largest level of practicality, and space saving, really. So instead of having like a traditional van that has your engine in front of you and then you are sitting behind a position behind the front axle and behind the front wheels, in these vans you are at the forefront of the vehicle, and the axle is sitting either under you or slightly behind you. So your wheels are behind you. That way you can maximize your space. And that way you can maximize your visibility instead of having to worry about a large engine compartment, a large hood in front of you, and wheels that you're going to have to worry about that are going to potentially block your view. Now, in America, I guess it never really necessitated that we would have these things, considering the fact that American roads are very large. You don't require much visibility. Visibility is not really a problem here in America because the roads are so large and we have so much space. However, in places like Europe, in places like Japan, where roads tend to be narrower, when roads tend to be smaller, more crowded, and maybe even more difficult to see around corners, it is very practical to have a design like this that puts you at the forefront so you can see everything, and then you can worry about the rest of the vehicle behind you when you know you can make it through. In Japan, these cab forward designs, not really cab forward, forward control designs, I should say, are extremely common. You find them in the Nissan Caravan. You find them in the Toyota Hiace. You find them in the Toyota Light Ace. You find them in also, the Nissan El Grand. All of the Japanese vans that I saw when I was in Japan were cab forward or forward control designs. I've never been to Europe before, but from what I've seen researching this, this is the same thing. So the reason why I go into all of that is because the Volkswagen Bus, and I think it was like the Renault H van or something at the time. These were the vans that really started that. And I believe the Volkswagen Bus might have even gone into production before it. I mean, I'm not sure, but I'm believing it could have gone into production before the Renault H van or whatnot. And even if it didn't, it's the one that left behind the legacy. Nobody knows what a Renault H van is. But everybody knows what a Volkswagen Bus is. So that really ushered in a trend not only for Europeans, but for the Japanese and really the world over. Because in places where roads are small, roads are narrow, roads are difficult to see around, these vans are superior in practicality than your regular vans that have a big engine, a hood, and front axle in front of you that you can't, it's a blind spot. It's a giant blind spot. You can't see directly what's in front of you. I mean, you can see what's in your line of sight, but you can't see directly what's in front of your hood. If you didn't have a hood to worry about, if the engine was underneath you instead of in front of you, then you wouldn't have to worry about the hood. You wouldn't worry about where the axle is. You wouldn't worry about your front bumper. You could be able to be there so you can see everything. So that's basically why these things are so practical. Let's talk about the cultural legacy. It was very popular in the hippie/counterculture movement of the 60s. These vans would be painted and modified to fit the tastes of hippies of the period. The van is among one of the most iconic and recognizable designs of all time. It was featured in countless movies and video games. There's a character in the movie Cars that's based on a Volkswagen Type 2. There is the Mystery Machine in Scooby-Doo that at first was based on a Volkswagen Type 2. Then I believe it became like a Dodge van and then finally a Ford van. But it was at one time a Volkswagen Type 2. Even in GTA San Andreas, the camper is an obvious representation of the Volkswagen Type 2 within the game, and it's even used by a hippie in one of the missions in that game too. I mean, these things are unique. They're unique in the legacy that they've left behind. Very few vans can claim that legacy. I mean, of course, you get cars like the Nissan Skyline that everybody, in the car community knows. But this one, everybody knows these cars. These things can even be driven in Forza games. I know I usually say Forza, but it's technically pronounced Forza. It's ubiquitous. I mean, anytime you have any sort of car discussion about classic cars, I mean, the Volkswagen Bus comes up. I mean, it is an iconic Volkswagen product, an iconic vehicle in general. this was what kind of, makes me happy. And I guess what really caused me to have more interest in doing a podcast in this, because I was like, what should I do my next podcast on? Talking to Katie, my girlfriend. And she's like, just do it on the Volkswagen Bus. Everybody knows what those are. I was like, that's perfect. And as I was doing more research, I was like, yes, this is a cultural icon. I mean, there are very few vehicles out there that are used first and foremost for practicality purposes that have this sort of cultural weight to them. And this is what makes me happy, is when people who are not car people who see cars as a means to an end, seeing them as a way to get from point A to point B, where even they take interest in these sort of vehicles, because the vehicles have not only been able to capture the psyche of the average car person, the really enthusiastic car person, but it's also been able to capture the psyche of those who are not car people at all. And I think that's amazing. That is a talent that the Volkswagen Type 2 has. Volkswagen Type 2 is been able to draw people together. Whether you are a car person, whether you are not a car person, whether you are an amateur car person, whether you're a professional car person, whether you're a race car driver, whether you are a luxury car driver, whether you are a motorcycle driver even. I mean, like, everybody loves the Volkswagen Type 2. It is the car that brings people together. If the Volkswagen Type 1 was the car that got everyone on the roads, well, the Volkswagen Type 2 was the people who united them in their love of Volkswagen buses. I mean, it was the one that united the people. The Volkswagen Type 1, the Beetle, got people on the roads, while the Volkswagen Type 2 united the people. I mean, everybody can have a discussion about one of these. Everybody remembers these. If they don't remember them, they know about them at least, and they have some cool story about, one time they saw one on the road and whatnot, and it was so cool, and it was painted like a hippie van, blah, blah, blah. I mean, these are awesome. Everybody sees them, and they're like, oh, that's so cool. It's a Volkswagen Type 2. It's a hippie van. Like, they've got peace signs and all sorts of foolishness. I mean, that's just so heartwarming, knowing that by no intention of Volkswagen, these things have been turned into a cultural icon. Same thing with the Volkswagen Type 1, the Beetle. They've been turned into cultural icons by no intention of Volkswagen when it was started at all. I mean, who would have known that Adolf Hitler, who basically commissioned Volkswagen to start, it was his idea. Who would have known that he would have actually left a shred of even the slightest positive impact on the world by causing these cars to be made? I mean, obviously it doesn't outweigh the bad that he's done, but look, there is something good that came of his reign, at least, if I may even say that. I mean, it's an amazing fact that the Volkswagen Beetle and the Volkswagen van have been able to have such an impact. Let's talk about the business legacy. 5 more generations spawned as a result, and in 2017, Volkswagen announced an electric version would come out in 2022. So not only did they have huge success in the first generation of the Volkswagen Bus, I believe something like 11 million were made or something like that. Some ridiculous number, like a huge amount. I don't know if that's including the first generation or all generations, but still, a huge amount of Volkswagen buses were made. They're still making them. There was the second generation, there was the third generation, the fourth generation, the fifth generation, and the sixth generation. And if it's like people still find these to not only be practical, but people find them to be useful as well. And that's what's the great thing is. I mean, the Beetle is no longer being produced, but the Volkswagen Type 2 is still being produced. For example, the first generation was from 1949 to 1967, 1950 model year, I should say. And then the second generation, The second generation was produced from 1967 to 1979, still keeping classic styling, still very recognizable as a Volkswagen Bus. And then the third generation was produced from 1979 to 1992. And then the fourth generation was 1990 to 2003. Fifth generation was 2003 to 2015. And then the sixth generation is 2015 present. And these are all called the Volkswagen Transporter now, which is what basically the Volkswagen Type 2 was officially known as in Volkswagen, either the Combi, the Transporter, or the commercial panel van. I mean, it was one of those three. So the fact that it lives on as the Volkswagen Transporter, this is a direct descendant of that. And there's a Volkswagen microbus concept, the electric vehicle that's coming out in 2022, according to Volkswagen. So this has really left a legacy. I mean, these are cars that one will never forget. The world will never forget, and Volkswagen won't allow you to forget them. And that's a great thing, and that's great business for them, because they are the type of company, if something ain't broke, they ain't gonna fix it. I mean, I can't say the same for some other car companies. Chrysler, I'm looking at you, but these are the car companies that once they know they've got a good product, they're going to milk it for all of its worth, and the public is not only going to love them, the public is going to appreciate them, and the public is going to throw money at them too. So please stay tuned for the next segment of the podcast, in which I am going to be talking more in depth about my thoughts on the Volkswagen Type 2 and the Volkswagen microbus concept that's going to be coming out pretty soon too. So please stay tuned and enjoy the break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
All right, car folks, this segment we are going to be talking about the Volkswagen microbus concept that's coming out in 2022, not 22. That was 2,000 years ago, the year 22. Anyway, moving on. So, in the last segments, we discussed the background of the Volkswagen Beetle, not the Volkswagen Beetle, the Volkswagen Type 2, the Volkswagen Bus, and we also discussed the legacy of the Volkswagen Bus. So in this segment, we are going to be talking about the Volkswagen microbus electric concept that's coming out in about 2 years now, almost just a year, because 2020 is almost over. It's already November. Wow. Happy Halloween for all of those who celebrate it, by the way. And another thing, we are going to be talking about my thoughts. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. We are going to be talking about my thoughts on the Volkswagen Type 2 and the Volkswagen Bus, if it wasn't obvious enough. But what I want to say is that the Volkswagen microbus, when I heard about this, I was, to tell you the truth, I wasn't very excited. I'm still trying to figure out if I'm excited for the dawn of well, not the really dawn, but the rebirth of electric cars. Electric cars have been around for almost as long as gas cars. It's not really a dawn. It's a rebirth. of electric cars, the renaissance, if you will. I'm still trying to figure out if I am excited about that, or if I'm sad, or if I'm salty. Probably a combination of all three, depending on the vehicle. Tesla makes me salty, but that's mostly because I think Elon Musk is just a person with too much money, and he's just trying to figure himself out, and he's doing a little bit of everything along the way, which granted is fine, but when you're going to be in the car community, I mean, you kind of focus on the car community and, you know, keep that in the forefront of your mind. That way, so your cars don't have quality control issues. They come out with two different colored panels on the inside of the doors. I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, if he hadn't been focusing so much on SpaceX or whatever on Earth he focuses on, I mean, he could have, you know, been making better cars. But that's, you know, my side point. Teslas don't make me excited. But when I hear this, I mean, like, I wasn't extremely excited, but it's intriguing to me. It's intriguing because they're like, wow, they're bringing back a classic vehicle. They're bringing back a classic vehicle, and they're going to make it an electric car. And not only are they going to make it an electric car, they're going to make it, you know, a production electric car. It's not going to only stay in concept alone. And I find that to be very interesting. Reason why I find that to be very interesting is because I think this might see a dawn of vehicles return as electric vehicles. There's already a trend in the car world to bring back popular models of old, starting with what I can remember being like the Camaro. The Camaro was brought back, I believe, in 2007 after about 10 years, about maybe 5 or 6 years of not being in production, and it was brought back as a retro model. The Challenger was brought back around the same time period. The Charger was brought back at around the same time period. These are all American muscle cars, obviously. But I could remember the trend beginning in which they were beginning to bring back cars from, you know, older time periods, and they were bringing them back as retro vehicles. So now that, you know, technology has advanced to the point where we can make practical electric cars, this might see a renaissance. And even though Volkswagen stopped producing the Beetle last year in 2019, it would be its last model year, who knows? Maybe the Beetle will be brought back as an electric vehicle, which I think the Beetle would be a perfect contender for an electric vehicle, because I believe they will sell like hotcakes, just like the Beetle had already sold like hotcakes in its heyday. If you make the Volkswagen Beetle the electric car of the people instead of the Tesla Model 3 or whatever, you know, pretentious foolishness that Elon Musk is up to these days. If you make the Volkswagen Beetle, which was originally the car for the people, the Volkswagen, like the wagon of the folks, maybe if you make that electric, maybe the folks can have an electric wagon now and be actually more inclined in buying electric vehicles. You use that same sort of model that you did. It was cheap, it's efficient, and, you know, it's easy to produce, and it's reliable, and then you apply that to an electric vehicle, maybe it might be the same way. So I think maybe, you know, the fact that Volkswagen is going to be making a microbus electric concept, maybe that could be a teaser for, you know, a Volkswagen Beetle electric concept. Who knows? The possibilities are truly endless. Possibilities not only are truly endless, but there's so much that they want to do with the Volkswagen electric concept, the Volkswagen microbus electric concept that, you know, that's not really being done right now. As far as I know, nobody else has any plans for an electric van that's going to be affordable. Get this. Here are some of the specifications about the Volkswagen microbus concept, the electric vehicle that should be coming out in 2022. It's still in concept form, obviously, so some of these things might change before production, but it's supposed to have 300 plus miles of range available. That it's supposed to be capable of that. Maybe the highest trim level, maybe the one with 2 motors is going to have the most range, because that's what makes sense. But it's supposed to have over 300 miles of range. Like I had said with the Hummer EV, this has really gotten me excited for electric cars, because now I really don't have an argument anymore when it comes to, well, the range is not practical. The range is practical now because, like I said, my Buick, a traditional car with an internal combustion engine that takes 17 miles to the gallon city, 26 highway, that only takes premium fuel and has an 18.5 gallon fuel tank. On a full tank, on a good day, gets about 350 miles. Because that's not just highway driving. Highway driving, I can stretch it like 400 miles, but that's not realistic because there are city roads that I have to drive on as well. So combined city and highway, my range on my car is about 350 miles. Now they're saying that this Volkswagen microbus can have up to 340 miles of range. And it can charge up to 80% in about 30 minutes. So it has quick charging capabilities too. You don't have to charge it for hours like you do, some other earlier electric vehicles. So at this point, you're saying, why not? If you want to try out an electric vehicle, you want to save money on gas, you want to be environmentally conscious, and you want a vehicle, frankly, that's more reliable than a gas vehicle, and a vehicle that is going to be, more practical as far as cargo area because you don't have an engine to worry about. You could have cargo in the front, and a vehicle that's going to be better performing than a gas vehicle. Why not get an electric vehicle at this point? Before, I used to be so staunchly against electric vehicles, but now even me, who I consider myself very difficult to influence, is seeing how practical and how great electric vehicles could be. Ever since I saw that Tesla Model S with 450,000 miles on it, I'm like, dude, I forgot how reliable electric vehicles are. Your battery goes out, it won't take a charge anymore, just change the battery, you're back to new. I mean, electric motors are obviously way simpler than internal combustion engines. You don't have to worry about head gaskets, you don't have to worry about cylinder liners, you don't have to worry about water pumps, you don't have to worry about this, you don't have to worry about that. You don't have to worry about a bunch of foolishness when it comes to these things. So, I mean, even if your electric motor fails, you could just get it swapped out and connect another one. How hard could that possibly be? I mean, granted, now that electric vehicles are experience a renaissance, I mean, they're not completely common just yet, but you will get to a point where there are going to be so many mechanics trained in the art of working on electric vehicles as well as internal combustion vehicles, or you can have mechanics that are just specialized in working on electric vehicles. That's going to be real easy to get these things done. Right now, it's a question of practicality, not only in range, because most models produced these days don't provide that sort of range, and it's a question of practicality in parts availability, reliability, as far as daily driver reliability. It's still a legitimate concern right now, but pretty soon it may not be a legitimate concern, and I think Volkswagen is capitalizing on that. Volkswagen is a very, very, very smart company. And they are capitalizing on the fact that, look, they're bringing something back that's recognizable, that was very popular in its heyday, and they're bringing it back right at the renaissance of electric vehicles. And they're giving it a very practical range that's not going to give people range anxiety when they start driving the thing, which, believe me, is a real thing. This is going to be capable of having two motors, one on the front axle, one on the rear axle. Base model will come with a real rear axle motor that makes 201 horsepower, and then all-wheel drive versions will come with two motors, one on the front, one on the rear, and combined that's going to create 369 horsepower. It's going to be built on the same platform, which is VW's modular electric drive platform that is the same as the 2020 Audi e-tron. So it's going to have Audi underpinnings, which is exciting. A Volkswagen with Audi underpinnings, but don't all Audis and Volkswagen share underpinnings anyways, but moving on. It's going to have special interior features. This is what's going to be really interesting. The special interior features include configurable seating. Seats that can be laid down, spun around, or removed completely, and possibly even the concept of a fold-away steering wheel. I mean, last time I saw a fold-away steering wheel, I think it was like in a Buick. And that was like in the 60s. And I'm not even sure if that feature made it even to production. I think that was just a concept vehicle that had a fold-away steering wheel. This may have, I'll have to do more research on that. But that's very interesting indeed. And pricing is going to be estimated as an MSRP starting at $40,000. The average new car today costs about $35,000. So that's just going to be $5,000 more than your average new car. That's accessible. That's not even accessible if you're like, oh, well, if I make it wealthy one day, then it's attainable. No, that's accessible. Like, you can actually do that. That is realistic to buy that. That is realistic to buy that you might see these on the road a lot. That you might see them more than Teslas. Because Teslas tend to be pretty expensive, except the Model 3, of course. Like, you might see these on the road a lot, especially for families who are environmentally conscious and who want something cool. This is going to be real cool. Retro styling, fold-away seats, spun-around seats. There's even talk about putting a table inside of it. I mean, there's so many different things that you can do with this. But that's amazing. Concerning my thoughts on the Volkswagen Beetle, I guess not the Volkswagen Beetle, gosh darn it. I keep on saying that. Volkswagen Type 2. Just to be real quick to fit within the time constraints we have here. I think the Volkswagen van is the only van that I would drive, first of all. The electric concept excites me, but like I said, Volkswagen is a very, very smart company. They knew what they were doing from the very beginning. Did they know it was going to blow up and become a cultural icon? Perhaps not. But they knew that it was going to be popular, and they knew that they can take what they already had, listen to this Dutch man's idea, and create a van that could haul cargo, that can haul people, that can even be comfortable for families to take on trips, that can be used as a camper, that can be used as so many other things, and profit off of it when they really didn't have to change much. All they had to do is slap on a new body to a platform they already had and use the same exact engine. And that was very, very smart. I've seen car companies do this before, and this was probably the most successful version of that. Chrysler's K-Car was successful as far as keeping Chrysler afloat. But as far as being cultural icons, they're kind of made fun of nowadays. But this is a very respectable vehicle that had a respectable vision and that did a lot of things that are really commendable in the car community. So yeah, those are basically my thoughts on the Volkswagen Beetle. Not the Volkswagen Beetle, the Volkswagen Type 2, the Volkswagen Bus. So those are basically my thoughts. So please stay tuned after the break, and then you will hear a long-awaited update on my poor car and what ended up happening to it. So please stay tuned after the break.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
Okay, welcome back, folks, after the break. In the last segments, we discussed the Volkswagen Type 2 that I kept on hilariously calling the Volkswagen Beetle. Built on the same platform as the Beetle, but not the same car. You heard the background, you heard the legacy, you heard the thoughts for the future as far as an electric concept goes, and you heard what my own thoughts were about the entire thing. So now I'm going to give you an update on my car. So last time you all heard, my car had a bad a mass airflow sensor. That's what it was. It had a bad mass airflow sensor, and then they ended up figuring out that the intake gaskets needed to be changed as well. The intake manifold gaskets. Lower intake manifold gasket, upper intake manifold gasket. So it was fixed. And I was driving it back home from work earlier this week on a Tuesday when I was asked to come or I guess it was technically last week now when I was asked to come in for 3 hours at my job. And I noticed that the car was revving erratically once again, and the car had to be stopped and pulled over, and I needed to turn it off, turn it back on, and it still kept on revving erratically, and eventually I made it home. And so when I got home that day, I slept because I had gotten back at like 7:30, and then I had been up since 3:30 at that time. I slept, woke up at around 11, and then I went outside to go tend to my car. I disconnected the battery, that whole spiel, I had to end up calling the tow truck. Tow truck takes my car back to Aniel's shop in Fort Myers. All right, so this is what Aniel tells me when he gets to finally looking around my car later on that day. This was a Tuesday. By Wednesday, the car was ready. So this is what ended up happening. Apparently, when he was pulling the intake manifold gaskets, when he was pulling those off and he was taking the engine apart to change said gaskets, which, by the way, he did a wonderful job. I mean, he replaced them with metal and rubber gaskets instead of plastic and rubber gaskets that had come from the factory. But even if he had replaced them with factory ones, I mean, they probably would have lasted another 140,000 miles, let's be honest. I mean, it's a Buick 3800 engine. Those engines are nearly impossible to kill. But he replaced them with metal and rubber ones that are even, more reliable and more ruggedly built and more durable is the word I'm looking for than the ones from the factory. So not only did Aniel do that, but Aniel was also able to figure out what the problem was. Aniel found out that it was a vacuum hose that had popped off, because when he was pulling it, apparently it cracked a little bit, the vacuum hose, because my car, get this, is 17 years old for people who don't know this. And I live in Florida, and heat tends to deteriorate rubber. It was dry rotted. And the hose ended up cracking, and it eventually got to a point it couldn't hold on to the nozzle that it was supposed to be connected to, and it popped off, causing a vacuum leak in my engine, and then that caused the engine to not be able to get the amount of air that it needed. It kept on revving out of control because the vacuum leak was present. So he fixed the vacuum leak, and then upon further inspections, we found at least 2 other points of failure where we knew that vacuum hoses were going to end up popping off, simply because of the fact that these hoses are old and the fact that the heat has gotten to them after 17 years and they're beginning to crack, they're beginning to dry rot. So what I'm going to need to be done on my car now, I'm going to need to go through and replace a bunch of the vacuum hoses. There was this man, his name was Charlie. He used to be our mechanic before we encountered Aniel. He was a traveling mechanic. He wasn't in one set place. He used to come to our house and work on our cars. And he had told me back in 2019, early 2019, almost 2 years ago now, that I was going to need to get all of my vacuum hoses replaced at some point because they were beginning to dry rot. Except at that point we had found Aniel. We didn't use Charlie anymore, so Charlie never got around to doing that. And so I still have a bunch of leftover vacuum hose in the back of my car that had never been put to good use. But the funny thing is, it reminds me of a story that I had with my car. So Anya obviously fixed the car. Before I go into this story, Anya obviously fixed the car. The issue of the white steam coming out of the mufflers, I guess I looked it up. It's when they change the intake manifold gaskets or head gaskets, any gaskets in the engine for that matter. A little bit of coolant gets inside the engine, and the first couple of times you're driving the vehicle after the job has been done, it burns off that coolant. Since then, I haven't noticed any white steam coming from my engine, and my engine has been running absolutely marvelously. When I picked it up from on Yells on Wednesday. Wednesday's my day off. I went to go see my girlfriend in Sarasota. I mean, this thing was a positive joy to drive. Aniel told me how well the vehicle drove, and he told me it even drove better than my dad's Mercedes-Benz S-Class, which to me is a compliment of highest honor, even though I already knew that. But of course, don't tell my dad, because he's going to be like, oh no, my S-Class is just German. It's better than American cars, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, don't believe any of that foolishness. German cars are a trap. Stay away from them. Buy American. Thank you. But anyway, so, I mean, he told me how an absolute joy the car was to drive, how well it drove, and I experienced it for myself. My car felt alive. My car had power. I put my foot down on the gas and it went. I mean, there was no hesitation. There was nothing about it. I mean, it was effortless. It was effortless to drive this vehicle. And that's exactly what I love about these cars. These cars, these American luxury cars with the large displacement engines. They are effortless to drive. You don't have to force the power out of it like I had to force the power out of my Honda Civic Hybrid that, used to do. It used to accelerate when it felt like it. It didn't accelerate because it was unpinched, it wasn't the same. It wasn't the same. This thing accelerated. I was passing people. I was stopping well. I was doing all the things that a car should do. And even after a couple of days where the charm of having the car back after a week has kind of worn off, it's still driving absolutely wonderfully. So what's next to do on my car? I don't know if I told you all this, but my car needs a new blower motor. The air conditioning is intermittently going out. The AC compressor is fine, so when I drive, I get forced air through the vents because the car is moving against the air is going through the vents. That air is air conditioned. So it's blowing cold air as I drive, but it doesn't blow when I stop because there's no airflow. And so the blower motor is either bad or the blower motor actuator, the electrical piece that controls the power of the blower motor, is bad. So I need to get that taken back to the mechanic and found out. I have a couple of motor mounts that are broken. This is a common problem on these old luxury cars. The motor mounts get broken after a while, and when you accelerate under hard acceleration, you might feel the motor thump a little bit. It's not a transmission issue or anything of that sort. It's just the physical movement of the engine because the motor mounts that are supposed to be supporting it aren't supporting it. Not only that, what are some other things? What are some other things that need to be done on my car? Front rotors need to be changed. I got front rotors resurfaced back in early 2019, but front rotors actually need to be changed now because when I brake, they shake a bit. If your car is, shaking under hard braking, that kind of rhymes actually, but if your car's shaking under hard braking, likely rotors that need to be changed because the rotor surface is beginning to get warped. They can resurface them, but after a while, you just need to get the rotors changed because the metal is warped, and it's those micro warps on the surface of the metal that are causing it to shake because it doesn't have a smooth surface for the brake shoe to bite against. That's really technical for the fact that, it's just wavy. It's not good anymore. It needs to be changed. What are some other things that need to be done on my car? I'm trying to remember. I covered motor mounts, blower motor, rotors. What are some other things that good old Betty Love needs? I need a new sending unit. What is a sending unit, you may ask? A sending unit is basically something that attaches to the fuel pump of your vehicle. It measures the amount of gases that's in your tank, and then it sends that reading to the computer that, puts it on your gas gauge. All gas gauges nowadays are digital, even though it may not have a digital readout, but they're all digitally calculated through the computer of the car. And my sending unit is bad, so it's not sending accurate information. So once my car gets down to a quarter tank, and that reminds me, I have to put gas. Once it gets down to a quarter tank and no longer reads accurately, And my car might say full, it might say half, it might say 3/4, it might actually say 1/4 like it actually is, or it might say completely empty. I mean, it's not accurate anymore. So that's one of those things that I need to get changed in my car. But other than that, I don't believe there's anything else. The mechanic gave my car a clean bill of health. He said the engine's good, the transmission's good. Transmission is the only part I ever worried about in the car because I know after a while automatic transmissions tend to go. I mean, my car has 143, almost 144,000 miles. It might hit 144,000 miles by the end of this week because I drive that often and I drive far all the time. It might hit 144,000 miles. I know the automotive Grim Reaper begins to, pay visits to your car at around 180,000 miles, especially when you have a front-wheel drive transmission, automatic transmission cars. I mean, that's not the best way to set up a transmission. Ideally, transmissions should be rear-wheel drive and manual to create the most the most reliable sort of configuration. I mean, my configuration is not known for being extremely reliable into high mileage vehicles. Not to say that they don't last. Of course, they can last, but they require some maintenance. So yeah, I'm afraid about the transmission going next. Knock on wood 3 times. But other than that, I think the car has been doing absolutely wonderfully. Betty is holding up very well. Betty is a perfect clean of bill health, or perfect clean of bill health. Perfect bill of clean bill of health. That's what I meant to say. Not perfect yeah, I'm sorry, I can't speak. But anyway, you all heard about the Volkswagen Type 2, the bus, the microbus, the combi, the hippie van, whatever you want to call it. And you heard about my update that I promised you all on my beloved Buick Park Avenue. She is doing well. She is doing fine. And unless something else pops up that's not worth fixing, I intend to drive her until the end of her time, maybe even the end of my time, whichever comes first. The car might outlive me. I'm serious. So please, thank you so much for listening to this edition of the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, David Lucy Mabel. Please leave us a like on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Follow us on social media, leave us a comment, leave us a review, do something, and let your folks know about us in the car community. Everybody knows other car people, so get them to listen to this as well. Thank you so much, folks, and have a wonderful, wonderful night.
You've been listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's episode.